I'm pleased to introduce Alissa Quart to Politics and Prose. Quart is the author of 4 acclaimed books: Branded, Republic of Outsiders, Hothouse Kids, and Monetized, a volume of poetry. She writes a bi-monthly column for The Guardian, and her work appears frequently in many other publications, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, and The Nation. In Squeezed, Quart examines the lives of middle-class Americans who can now barely afford to raise children. Reporting on families just getting by, as well as including her own experience, Quart reveals that parenthood is financially overwhelming to everyone except the wealthiest. In addition, she provides real solutions, from necessary policy shifts to a blueprint for helping us to see parenting and caregiving as both professionally and politically valuable. David Korn, co-author of Russian Roulette, writes, Quart deftly chronicles the plight of Americans confronting the dangerous rise of middle-class financial instability. Squeezed is journalism at its best, exploratory, visceral, and searching for answers. An important work to which attention should and must be paid. Quart will be joined in conversation tonight by Barbara Ehrenreich, author of the classic Nickel and Dimed, with whom she co-founded the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, a nonprofit for reporting on inequality. Now please join me in welcoming Alissa Quart and Barbara Ehrenreich.
Hi, I'm Barbara, and I thought I would start by introducing Alissa a little bit more, but just sort of how I came to know her. I started something called the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which is this.
There's some more for people up here if they're interested.
Was it 4 or 5 years ago?
At this point, 6 you started.
6? Oh my God! And before Alissa came along, I have to tell you, we were floundering in many ways, and I take a lot of the blame. I'm not able to manage or figure out, projects. I just like articles and essays and things like that. So.
But explain the point of EHRP. What were you trying to do with EHRP?
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot. The idea was that we would raise money so that we could pay low-income people, journalists generally, and there's no shortage of low-income journalists. So because nobody else is paying us anymore. The well, I don't know if I should mention the Atlantic.com.
Well, there's been, according to CJR, there's been a 50% contraction of newsrooms since 2005. So that's a lot of jobs that are lost. So we are seeing a lot of people who need some help.
Yeah, lost jobs, but also who will, turn in a 2,000 or 3,000 piece to some well-known online site and be told, oh yeah, we can pay you $75 for that. And that, that's impossible if you've worked weeks or months on this piece. So we thought we would come in and say to the writer or the photojournalist, whatever, we'll pay you at what used to be the old standards, like $1 a word for...
Which was the standard in 1995.
Yeah. So we didn't have any trouble attracting people who wanted to do this. One of them who came along as an editor was Alissa. And not only is she an editor, but she's a writer, of course. And she, well, I don't want to make this sound Machiavellian, but she took over the organization. In no time at all. She was the executive editor. And what am I? The founding... Okay, I have something. But she took it over because she had the vision, she had the imagination, she had the energy, the incredible energy to work with so many people on their pieces, get those pieces placed, and write her own. I want to say about this book... a lot of it, or most of it, I guess, comes out of discussions at EHRP. Yeah. We would talk about something like who takes care of the immigrant nanny's children while she's here working for wealthy white people. And that would turn into a series.
Yeah, yeah. And then then much elongated into one of the main chapters in the book about a caregiver named Blanca who was separated from her son for 10 years. He was in Paraguay and she was here, and she was taking care. It's a very common story, taking care of, middle class people's kids, and what that experience was like. And it's called the global care chain. That's the handle that people give, like, you leave your kid back home, they're taken care of by family, and then you in turn become a caregiver for other people's children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So care is being drained off from the poorer countries to the richer countries in the world. But anyway, that's just one topic. There are so many that turned into, finally, chapters in this wonderful book, which you will find is a pleasure to read, as well as very, very instructive. Now, I have a lot. I have a lot of questions.
Great.
And I have to start.
Let's hear it.
Well,
and if anybody wants me to read, I will read too.
Now, I think you can talk as well as you can read.
Okay.
I mean, you can talk pretty well.
Okay, thank you.
But
thanks, Mom.
All right, let's start with one that's sort of, maybe I heard it anyway coming up before we started, is why is the work of caring for others so undervalued in our culture? And I mean, caring in general, what parents do, more specifically mothers do, and what home health work aides do, and nurses' aides do, and so many other people. What is wrong with this kind of work that it gets so little respect or pay?
So what I was seeing when I was going out and reporting with nannies, and I spent embedded in a 24-hour daycare facility. I don't know how many people here know about that, but it's a kind of growth industry. At now, 9% of caregiving is on off hours and on weekends. And there's a lot of sort of centers that have cropped up to fulfill that need. So I wound up spending a lot of time in one of them. And all these people who are working for the nannies, the caregivers, and I talked to many nannies who had left their kids overseas, they're being paid not a lot, but part of it's the devaluing of care. And I think it's about gender and race. But then I also think it's a part of the trap of the middle class too, because a lot of the families who are paying these people, they themselves are not always so wealthy. So that's, what I was trying to get at in this book, that I think of them as matryoshka dolls, Russian dolls that stack within each other, that the caregiving crisis, or how little these people are paid and what the quality of their lives are then within these strained middle class moms and dads who are then, I'm sure people in this room are going to be able to talk to that. So I think it's complicated. Like, I don't think it's just we're victimizing the carers. We demonize care though, and I think that's a different thing. Like, why don't we care about care? And I thought about it, and I think it's partially because we're afraid. We want to separate love and money, and we don't want them to contaminate one another. And so I think that's part of. So we imagine that people who do care work don't need to be paid, aren't interested in money. I think parents sort of fool themselves too around that. They want to think they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart. It's complicated.
Yeah, but that in fact, in the history of nursing, nursing was originally thought to be instinctual. So why pay them? Well, you just pay them a little tiny bit. Anyway, it goes on.
So in my book, I call that I found the kind of some of the social science on it. It's a prisoner of love theory. Like, they're so filled with love that they will work for very little money, and it's sort of part of our emotional economy depends on that love.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. One of the things that runs through your book, which is very, very upsetting to me, is the penalties placed on women for motherhood. the instant you are perceived to be pregnant, your boss may start ignoring you. You may be shuffled off to another less important department or something. Then when the baby comes, well, forget about it. I mean, that it used to be at one point, maybe I'm thinking of the 19th century here, that giving birth and raising a child was seen as important work and a contribution to society. Now, it's something that has to be penalized.
Right. So people here are maybe familiar with the Motherhood Penalty, which is there was a survey that found that people wanted to pay mother employees $11,000 would offer. This was a hypothetical. Would offer mothers $11,000 less than childless women, and then a lot less than men. So around that, there's become a whole kind of sociological worldview, so motherhood penalty, and a lot of women here have probably experienced that. So I don't have to tell you, it's not an abstraction, right? But actually, in my book, I argue for that there's the opposite of it, that there's a motherhood advantage, which I can get into also. There's a kind of focus that people have told me about, and it actually exists. There's social science around that as well, and there's neuroscience around it. So every time you get penalized, you can also sort of try to think to yourself, what I'm hoping people who read my book, there may be an advantage that my employer doesn't know. I'm actually sharper and I'm more organized. I organize my time better. I know how to deal with other minds. Children have radically different minds. So maybe I'm more flexible with the people I encounter in my daily life. But for the most part, I don't think this awareness is in the workplace.
No, I don't think it's there at all. A few years ago, I did a journalistic experiment and went looking for a white-collar corporate job. Just, to see what happens. And
is this Bait and Switched?
Yeah.
This is her
the book
is
called Bait and Switch.
Into white-collar jobs with using your maiden name, right? Or
I used my maiden name.
Barbara Alexander.
I changed to my maiden name.
Ass.
Legally. What?
It's amazing that you did that. Yeah.
And I started out with a resume just telling something of the truth. Not that I was a writer or anything like that, but that all these things I had done, my activities in the PTA, etc., organizing this and organizing that, they laughed at me. They worse than laughed. It's just like, whoop. Any experience you have as a parent is not relevant to your employment. Now, we would like to convince them that we're smarter because we're parents, but we haven't done that yet.
No, we haven't. But I would love to hear also at the end of the conversation, like, do women here feel that they've had or men too, a parenthood advantage, that as a worker or as a thinker? So keep that in your mind.
Yeah. But I was wondering, what you think about this, Alissa. It never occurred to me to ask you this before, but given all the penalties on us for parenting, why should we do it anymore? Why are we doing it? I mean, I know so many women in their 30s who are desperate to have a child before the time runs out or something. I wonder, after reading your book, why?
Oh, no.
Why?
And
I'm a very happy mother and grandmother. So I understand that side of it. But it's just, is having children getting to be a luxury for like the Angelina Jolies of the world?
Well, certainly, if you look at some of the people with many children have a lot more money than people with one child now. It depends, right? There are all these sort of wealthy people with many, many children. Mm-hmm. Because they can afford.
Yeah, and you're more representative of your age group with one.
With one, yes. I think what is it now? It's 1 point something? 1.6, yeah.
Okay. Well, it's just, I think, a question that we have to throw out there and ask in our own lives. Are we doing it? It's
is
not
this like the new natural causes? It's like, instead, let's not wait till we're old. Let's just not have children at all. But yeah. No, but that's very bleak.
It's very bleak, but that's what your book got me thinking.
Oh dear.
But I always think bleakly. I mean, you got to, right? I'm not gonna. Let's not go there. Let's not even talk about anything that's happening in the world. Um, now, another kind of question. Is this really new? The struggles of the educated middle class that wants to do creative things. Seems to me there's also the story of my life in here, and I'm old.
Okay, so Barbara wrote a very important book called Fear of Falling, in which you document some of this. So my interest, actually, I do want to flip this back because I want to. Do you see a huge difference now from fear of, like, from these accounts that I'm from the people you and the worlds that you looked at back then, the 80s, mid 80s?
Oh, it's a huge difference. The educated middle class was once had some stability. You knew that if you could get your children through college and they could get a profession, everything would be okay, right? That was the goal. Now those professions are crumbling. I mean, certainly you focus in one chapter on the law, which everybody thought was the stablest of them all, practically.
Yeah, everything. There's 3 states that don't have surplus lawyers. The phrase, or excess lawyers. That was the phrase. So in all the other states, there's too many lawyers to go around. Much too many. And that was interesting. I talked to people who had a lot of law school debt, who practiced as lawyers, and these were not just people who didn't make it. It was also people who had been lawyers and they couldn't sustain it. And I mean, this is kind of an interesting. The sea change you're talking about is also like a way of thinking about what a middle class person is. Like if you think of images from the 50s or 60s, it's like Revolutionary Road, Richard Yates, right? It's like humdrum. Like everyone spent the 60s and 70s trying to escape from that trap, right? Those conventions.
Right.
And then this is like, can we ever get into the conventions? Can we ever be boring? Can we ever have a humdrum life that's the same every day? The commute is half an hour on the train. It's not an hour and a half. So I think some of this is like changing how we think at least this is what my reporting showed me, changing what we think of the category middle class.
And look at college teaching, another admired profession at one point. Say you were a professor, people immediately respected you. Now, as Alissa points out, most of the teaching, 70%?
Well, there's different numbers. Some say 75%. I'm going with 40%. I'd be willing to tolerate 50%. But there's a large number of adjuncts. And for those who don't know, adjuncts are temporary teachers who don't have tenure, who don't have permanent positions that are renewable, who teach course upon course and often make like $3,000 a class. And 62% of adjuncts who were surveyed in this one survey made $20,000. So we're talking about after graduate school that they paid a lot for. It's poverty line kind of work. And I documented one of them and talked to many others. And her life was really, really hard. She was on food stamps. And since I've written this, I'm getting constant reports from people. Someone else was telling me that the adjuncts asked if they could go to the food bank at the college. That it was meant for the students. They said, we need to go to the food bank too. This was like 2 days ago. Someone was telling me this. And these are the kind of stories. And then there's broader questions like, should any of us be doing what we love? And I've tried to address some of that in the book. What does it mean to be interested in the humanities now? Can we afford that? That's another luxury, it would seem.
Well, yeah, 2 points there, or questions. One is the old boring jobs aren't as stable anymore. That book that you mentioned, Bait and Switch, was about the crisis among white-collar corporate workers. And I always thought that was a realm. All right, they sold out. They got it all. They're living fine. No. I mean, they have no job stability. They can be gone at any time and have to start all over at the age of 50 plus. So that's not so great anymore. But it leads me to a harder question here for you. Are you ready?
I'm scared.
You know, I always tell young people, do what you want to do. Sort of follow your passion, you know. Find out the color of your balloon or whatever.
Parachute.
Parachute.
I know the color of the balloon.
Sorry.
I'm not sure there's that much you could do with it. Just kidding.
I knew it was something that floated, but now, but after reading this, I thought maybe that's a wrong thing to say. Well, but I can't in good conscience tell them, oh, well, if you go get a job, as an assistant departmental manager for X corporation, you'll be safe. I can't say that either. So what do we say?
So I do have solutions in the book, and I'm sure and I can get into those, but I think part of what we do is we try to make people aware of what they're getting into. Because I tend to think that awareness at least makes people less vulnerable to self-blame and self-hatred and all the things that, why is this not working out? Why can't I? People are now writing to me and they're saying, why didn't I get that second job? But you tell me no stigma and I'm listening. And I'm like, oh, great. Like, that's what I want. I want people to at least, and then from there, start to look at more systematic problems. What is underlying this? How many administrators are there in the university system? There's now this adjunct rights organizing movement. It's called, one of the names of it is Tenure for the Social Good. There's a whole bunch. If anyone here is in the academia, I can tell you more about it. I don't know where Pat is, but yeah. She's an academic. But they're organizing around this. I had this idea that you go to U.S. News and World Report and you say, put in how many adjuncts teach. Put in how little they're getting paid
in their list.
And they're obsessed with prestige and appearances. And then if that was, they'd be tarred and feathered. So I wonder if there's certain ways that we could start putting pressure on these institutions and these kind of the corporate overlords of these industries, as it were. I mean, I know colleges are technically nonprofits, but we all know that's not entirely true. So, I mean, they're also quasi businesses. Can we put pressure on them? And if once we've overcome the sense that it's us, it's only us, our fault that this isn't working out, can we look out and start doing things?
And that's such an important point that you make again and again to the reader. It's not your fault. This is not because you're stupid or not creative enough or whatever you thought about it.
Not that you didn't work hard enough.
No.
Not that you did the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's so much language in both amongst liberal circles and conservative ones. We have bootstrapping on one side, we have leaning in on the other. What if we've done as much as we can?
Mm-hmm. So now we're emerged as I don't know how many more minutes we have. Oh, 5? Okay. With 5 minutes, and we can consider some of the political aspects and the outcomes. I mean, is there a chance for building an alliance between, say, the squeezed professional couple and their nanny? Because your book puts them
together
in the same,
and I did that on purpose because I wanted to show that it's a continuum of class instability, and then the middle precariat, which is what I call this shaken category of the middle class, resembles the working class precariat in many ways, in terms of contingency, in terms of hours, irregular hours, in terms of lack of security in old age, right? So why don't we start thinking about reframing it so then there can be more organizing around these two groups. And the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think, is part of what it really inspired me. I felt like this appears to be partially what happened, that these were kids in Astoria, hipster millennials who probably had a lot of debt, and Latinos in the area that were both voting her in and voting out the Yeah, I know, but I don't want to. I was going to say something snide, but yes, Crowley. No. Don't say it. Okay. But yeah, so that's and I felt like this is potentially, in a way, it's helpful. It's still helpful to think. I know Occupy did not function entirely, but to think about having a middle precariat and a precariat organizing around their own instability in some ways, and it's recognizing it. And that's what I mean about this kind of naming. Like if you can name it as a class problem rather than your problem, then you'll recognize the similarity that you might have to others. And that's the point of my book, really. Yeah.
I still think it'll take some effort to, bridge class differences, like the wealthy employers or the seemingly wealthy employers, that is to
You
their
mean the mothers
employees.
and fathers with their nannies and
to the people they employ.
Yeah.
That's gonna.
Well, we just wrote a piece together. It's in this week's New York Review of Books, which was making this point around Me Too. So if you're interested, you should probably read that. And that we talked about an organization called Hand in Hand. That is it's a small organization, but it's kind of inspiring in this way. And I mentioned in my book as well. They have parents and nannies kind of together in this group, working together. It's like to have higher wages, but also better household, mores, like cooking your food, and which, believe it or not, some parents don't like when their caregivers cook food that's aromatic in their kitchens, and that that kind of thing where you really have a recognition of the intimacy and humanity of this relationship, as well as what a decent wage is. And so that's a great organization.
Yeah, but it's small, but we
teeny
need
start,
more.
right?
But
These
I'm
are
just
small
saying,
starts.
there's a lot of problems in connecting across that class
and we're
gap.
hoping, like many of you, probably that Time's Up will have that element. It will be interclass.
And we were writing about the Me Too movement, which, as we were emphasizing, should be a movement of working class women, because the most abused and assaulted women workers in this country are hotel housekeepers. Agricultural workers was a surprise to me, and cleaning people. And there's just been very little outreach to them and attempt to bring them in to the Me Too movement. Not enough, anyway.
Not enough. So we're hoping there'll be more. And also the recognition then, like having your career derailed, like which is what many of the more higher echelon Me Too members might be worrying about, is not what the majority of people who are assaulted on the job are worrying about. They're not thinking of a career. They're thinking, I need to get paid, and I don't want to be deported, and I don't want to be raped. I mean, really more kind of severe stuff. But we can still make connections between these two conditions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I guess this will be the last question that I have before I let you all loose on Alissa. There was an article in the New York Times just a couple of days ago, right, suggesting that some of the kinds of frustrations and discontents that went into the Trump phenomenon and his election might also account for the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. If that is true, that's very, very interesting. And this is an interesting way to begin to look at some things. But do you see some chances for alliance across that gap?
Well, yeah, I mean,
political gap?
I hope so. I mean, that's what I'm I'm hoping it's a small pebble in the fight. Like that's what I'm hoping my book will be could be useful for. I mean, that's one of the things I'm hoping that people out there who are policy people or organizers could take it and do things with it that as a journalist or author can't. That's the hope. Okay,
I guess does anybody want to come up to the microphone and ask a question? Or it doesn't have to be a question, it could be an answer.
Yeah, thank you for coming. We've had so much, concerning the Federal Reserve, we've had so much quantitative easing, which is called printing money. Has that helped us or helped the local people? Or because I feel that we're just spinning our wheels and the Federal Reserve is just printing money.
Well, you should know, Alissa. No, I don't know. I think that's a question that is going to make us think now,
Yeah, we will think about it,
and
but we don't have an answer.
not
for you at
right
the
now.
moment. Yeah.
But it's our journalists' our job to come up with
We
an
will
answer.
come up with an answer for you. You will give us your email and we will answer you. I'm not kidding. We will.
According to the Pew Charitable Trust, our fertility rate in America is 1.8, which means we are in a situation of population decline. And my question is, are people aware of this? And is anybody besides me concerned that we are an endangered species?
I think that the overall issue is not about the U.S., but worldwide. We have achieved populations that our distant ancestors could never have imagined. In fact, a lot of people think that we went too far. There are too many people on the roads, too many people competing for housing, etc. But this is something to take into account when we maybe decide to whether to have children or not.
Well, I think people are. I mean, I think so, at least some of my subjects, they said, "Thank God I only have one." I mean, they'd often make asides like that. And I mean, my book wasn't really about fertility, but I realized that was. I mean, it factored into probably my own decision too to have one child.
But I do think that some of the reasons for that decline in American fertility are in this book, Squeezed.
Yes.
Hello. The problem is so big,
Yeah.
and the progress that we're making is so slow that we're really in trouble. We don't have a format of economics and statistics to even indicate what's going on now. We're at a loss to really understand it, so we're not getting the solutions. So, I mean, we're not dealing with distribution of wealth. We're not dealing with cash flow through the economy and how it works and jobs in the future. Okay, so do you see any place where this kind of thing is starting to take place?
Which kind of thing?
Where the planning and the economic overview of what's happening to our culture is starting to be retooled so that we understand what's happening to us.
I mean, again, I'm seeing a lot of smaller things like platform cooperativism, which I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but it's a movement where to rethink corporate apps. Like I write a lot about Uber, but these are worker-owned apps that are kind of collective, so that the people who are part of the co-op then possess some of the share of it, and that. I think one huge problem is the gig economy and the fact that it's has created a new ownership class. Mm-hmm. So that would be like one small thing that I think would be really useful. I mean, a lot of my book is, some of it's sort of broader stroke things, but the things that I really saw up close were things like that. I spent time at a co-op, or I talked to a lot of people who were really into UBI, Universal Basic Income. Were sort of UBI enthusiasts. And that was really interesting too. And I do think that is a potential solution which is probably impossible, but
Do you want to just explain what that is?
Universal Basic. It's an allowance for every family. It would be $12,000 to $20,000 a year, say. And it would just be provided, and it would kind of offset job losses for automation, daycare costs. As I write in my book, like many of the families I spoke to who were middle-class families spent at least 30% of their take-home pay on daycare. I mean, in New York, sometimes it was up to 38%. And so like something like UBI would be like, okay, this is this problem. Or the adjunct that I wrote about had a disabled son, like she had to care for him. So just to have basically kind of a allowance of this kind for those kind of
the government.
Yeah, but it's actually supported on the right as well, which is interesting. Like Charles Murray support. I mean, it's interesting. It's a lot of libertarians too. It's not just progressives.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm the mother of one child who's now 43 and has twins. And one of the phenomenon, and part of the reason I only had one child was so that it would not be an impediment to my career, and I had a very good career. But one of the phenomenon that you haven't addressed at all is the role of grandmothers and grandparenting. And that's critical among middle-class families. I said to my daughter, I'll help you in a pinch, but I'm not going to spend my time babysitting during my semi-retirement years. But I have a lot of friends who are committed to Monday and Wednesday or Tuesday and Thursday, or they split with the in-laws 4 days a week, and their retirement is geared to taking care of the grandchildren. And what are the economic implications of that? Part of it is certainly that when I babysit or my friends babysit, there's no cost involved. There's a cost to me and my life, but there's no economic cost to my daughter and son-in-law. And they're a typical middle-class, both professional family right in this town.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing that up, I say, as a grandma. And I'm one of those committed grandmas who's always available, you know. But we go unnoticed. Our contribution to the perpetuation of this class, it's not noticed. It's not.
Maybe it's something for you to write about.
Yeah, okay. All right. I'll take that as an assignment. Yeah.
So, it's great. It's a
Thank
good
you for
story.
bringing it up. Yeah.
Leslie Stahl just wrote a book about it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, she did, and it came out Mother's Day last year.
Yeah, Leslie Stahl just wrote about it.
Yeah, the joy of grandmothering or something like that.
I think Barbara's book would be quite different.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And this is
Hi, my name is Joe Williams.
Joe Williams
Joe Williams?
Yes.
This is one of our star writers. I'm not kidding.
from the Economic Hardship Reporting Project.
Thank you. Well, Alissa, it's fantastic that your book has come out, and I know you've got a lot to say about this subject. When I was listening to you, two things kept coming to mind. The first is, like, child care costs roughly for a middle-class family about as much as its college tuition, like between $20,000 and $50,000, $60,000 a year, depending on how many kids you have and depending on how quality the care is. Yet the workers don't make that much. Right. I mean, the workers are probably right around minimum wage, give or take. Who gets the money? I mean, number one, why is there such a differentiation between how much the child care providers get and how much the family has to pay? And secondly, what of the providers? I mean, you touched on this a little bit before, but who is taking care of their kids, and how do they get by?
I did talk about that, because the people who ran that daycare that I embedded in, for instance, their kids were very involved in the daycare, so that was kind of, I guess they were sort of scooped into it. It was in their house, and that's often, that's part of what happens. But Blanca and I talked to maybe 6 or 7 other caregivers who came from overseas. They left their kids at home with a grandparent. Again, it's a grandparent, whoever the grandma is. So it's but it's a global version of that grandparent story. So but then they're separated from their kids. I think usually it's local daycares that are even cheaper. So there's I've often thought that would be a good story for us to do too. Maybe you should do it, about the global care chain within neighborhoods, where you go down and into, and I think someone did a version of it, where there's informal daycares in kind of unstable, informal networks, right? And then you keep going, down the process where who takes care of the nanny's kids here? For those who are not overseas, I think you could be the right person for that.
Sure, I'd love to. But the other question is,
there you go.
My next assignment,
Yeah.
Who's doing it right? I mean, if the United States has this differentiation between, taking care of the children is kind of an afterthought almost, except when it comes time to cut the check, and we don't have good family leave, we don't have a lot of the support that other countries give their working families. What country is doing it right? Is there a model here in the U.S. that's having things go well and that we can kind of examine? And is there a movement to try to integrate those best practices here in the U.S.?
God, you must be a journalist. Those are really good. All this. So Okay, now I'm gonna lose. So Joe, before you go, what was the first one?
The first one was who's doing it right.
Who's doing it right? Okay, so I don't want to just say Denmark and Sweden. It's also places like Quebec, which charges where people are paying $7 to $20 a week, or is it a day or a week? It's now I'm forgetting, but it is a very small amount of money for care, and it's because they tax their citizens more and they're committed to the daycare services, and that's not some like Scandinavian Eden. That's like right across the border. And then what's the second question, Joe?
What best practices are being incorporated here in the U.S.?
Well, we tend not to pay attention to those other countries. We tend not to learn from them. I mean, how could we adopt anything from Canada? Canadians are so totally different from Americans. They're exotic. Anyway. There's this tremendous American arrogance that says we don't need to learn anything. But I think the short answer to your question is that countries that have always had a social safety net deal with these problems so much better than we do. And all the Northern European countries, for example.
How did we get this way, and why is it so bad?
Well, okay, so one short answer is in 1971, Nixon was going to sign an act that would have given, or was going to pass something that was going to give substantial amount of childcare to people, and then he vetoed it. So this was actually, and I love these moments in history when there's like moments in the past that are more progressive than ours, because when people say, oh, this is impossible, it will never happen, you're like, oh, well, this almost happened in 1971.
So thank you for your book and making some of these dynamics more visible. And I do hope that people who are working on the structural issues will take it, and there will be enough, and actually look at some policy and other changes. As you were talking, I was thinking about this increase in what they're calling deaths of despair, right? The suicide rates, the opioids, et cetera. And your comment about the internalization, right, of people thinking it's about them individually and their inability to transcend class or economic challenges and structures that are locking them in and actually creating free fall. So I'm curious about what you have seen in those conversations. Are, people actually locating the problem as structural, who are living it as structural, as policy, or are they in fact internalizing it as about them and their inabilities to transcend? So, and I think for me, this is really tied to, the rags to riches story, right? Which has been a big force for propelling people forward. But when in fact they're locked in and they don't recognize the ossification, that's a setup, right? It's really poisonous to believe that to a certain degree. So I'm curious about what you find in that with the stories
so
you've written.
a lot of people I spoke to were blaming themselves. That was like a refrain, actually. And it was this kind of internalized self-doubt. Some of it, I've said this before, but I feel like we have a lot of blaming the other too, right? Blaming, Islamophobia, blaming, and I feel like there's two sides of the same coin in a weird way. So they're sort of like, oh, what's wrong with me? I want to cancel myself out. Like, what have I done wrong? And kind of, that was, and I sometimes would start talking to my subjects and be like, well, you did this and that, and sort of explaining what happened. But yeah, a number of them wound up okay in the end. So that I'm sort of committed to a kind of journalism that's very character centered. So it doesn't really follow, it's not forced, so some of the people wind up, you'll see by the end, they're like, they've made it. They're not living the American dream. That's still outside most people's reach, but they're on dry land, they're not near the poverty line, for now. So that's just, what, I don't know what that's attributed to: resilience, rethinking their lives in cogent ways, getting out of the decision fatigue that what decision fatigue is? It's the kind of exhaustion when you're partially when you're economically precarious, where you can't make choices. So, and I think that now affects the middle class too, in a way that it didn't used to in the past. We used to think, oh, this is where you can't think as clearly, you can't make clear choices, you can't plan, you don't know what the future will hold. So I think some of the people I spoke to, once they got into a slightly better position, then they were able to then make broader choices and plan. Yeah.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So,
hello. So in Spain, my home country, the fertility rate I think is 1.3. We also have our own economic problems. So there was an agency that's linked to the Spanish government. And they conducted a research and they found out that one of the main outcomes of our economic problems is that society is getting anxious, that there's an anxiety in a way in which people cannot fulfill the expectations.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Will you send this to me?
Yeah. It's an institute. So in your research, have you found any sense of anxiety among the American middle class? And also, do you think, because the research in Spain tried to explain why people first do not have enough time to read, to why some parents are actually working out for many, many hours and they aren't really spending as much time as they should with the kids. Also, why people are voting for extreme right to extreme left political parties. So it's a very detailed research. So
almost like a kind of mania.
Do you think that that's one of the things that's going on in American society?
That. I do. I mean, that is what you see. You see people working. Something like 40% of people work on non-traditional hours now in America. But yeah, it's amazing. I mean, that doesn't always mean that they're working at night. It could mean that they're just working strange clumps or, very part-time or whatever. But it is really strange. And it probably does feed anxiety to just not have regularity and not...
Especially at the lower paid reaches where you're on call.
Right.
You don't know what your hours will be. You just get a phone call saying, come in here now.
Yeah.
So what could you plan? You can't plan anything.
And I wrote about how they couldn't help their kids with people who were in that situation couldn't help their kids with homework because they'd be coming home at strange hours. So their kids were doing more poorly in school. So that was another finding. You're like, oh, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really interesting.
So, Barbara, first of all, your Nickels and Dimes was the first book of nonfiction I ever read. So thank you for giving me that. But your book, Squeezed, was covered in the New York Times. And if you go online, it's side by side with another book that just came out called Bull Star Jobs about.
You mean the David Graeber?
Yeah. And his thesis in that book was that there are so many people employed doing who knows what. And I think that's a really interesting idea to explore. Compared to your overeducated but still poor. So, I just graduated from Columbia and everybody was saying, are you going to sell out and go into investment banking? Which is not what I did. But how do you reconcile these people who are, or this situation that we're facing where there are people who are overeducated and still poor, but then we have a reason to write a whole book about people who are in jobs and jobs and jobs.
Well, they're part of the same thing. I mean, you know, the people who pursued what they loved and something that wasn't BS and it was authentic were often penalized for it. And then so many other people who sort of just did what they had to do are penalized in a different way. I don't mean they're alienated labor, right? So one is an attempt to not be alienated and find meaning, and then you're alienated in a whole other way because you don't have a steady job, and then there are people who have jobs that they don't care about at all. I think that they're quite related.
I would say to David Graeber, I haven't read his book, but I've read the excerpts, that almost any job you're in, you have to pretend to be busy at all times. You know that, right? No matter what it is, manual labor or whatever. That's the trick. In fact, that's what colleges should teach, how to look busy. Okay.
I look pretty busy.
All right, I think that might be it. I'm going to be here for signing. You've been an incredible audience. We're so glad to see you. We have more information about our organization, too, if you want to find out some more. Thank you a lot.